This meeting is being recorded.
And Ashley disappeared.
I'm here. I'm here.
That's all right. You just don't want to be on the video. I see how it is. Anyway, I want to go back. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, last week we weren't able to be together, but I want to say, number one, I really appreciated the conversation we had. It kind of got off the path with what it was, but what we were talking about was really good. Matter of fact, I went back and watched it again today, and it kind of helped bring some things up to speed, and it made me realize that I almost skipped a passage, and this passage is not so pertinent, but it is in a little bit. So we're going to go back to chapter 1. We kind of touched base on this 3 weeks ago about Paul going to Jerusalem for the very first time to meet with, my mind's fried, I'm sorry. Who did he meet with? Peter? Yeah, there we go. And he met with James. If you have your Bible there, turn with me back to Acts chapter 15, because I want you to see this, the parallels of what's happening. This is the first time Paul's gone to Jerusalem, and it's important because that when we get into 2, he's talking about this trip to Jerusalem to meet with them. Not only this one, but the second one as well. Give you a little bit of background so we don't have to read through all of it. Paul and the guys traveling with him on his journey have gone to Antioch, and the church is growing. He points some workers in the church, leaders, because he's getting ready to leave. But it says, picking up in 15, it says, "And certain men came down from Judea, taught their brethren, and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved." Here goes the Judaizers again. One of the biggest things I want to see is this has been an ongoing thing, and always was, and still is in some respects. Like we talked about, it may not be the law per se, but throughout Paul's ministry, throughout the New Testament, the same thing keeps cropping up again and again and again. There's always those people in the background. Let me go ahead and read verse 2, because I'm going to read a couple of them. Just hang with me. It says, "When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute." I love the way they put it. They had no small. In other words, they had a big argument. They determined that Paul and Barnabas and others of them should go up to Jerusalem and to the apostles and elders about this question. Let me just stop there a minute. A thought hit me earlier today. I don't think I've ever thought of this all my Christian life. Paul's from Jerusalem. He's not been back to Jerusalem since his conversion. It's been more than 3 years now. We're not exactly sure exactly how long, but it was at least 3 years. And he's not been back home. You think about it, he's left his home. He's left everything he owns. So he's just now going back. And I'm sure he's not even knowing what kind of reception he's going to get when he gets there. But he's going to talk with Peter. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically here's what happened. He gets together with Peter, and he spends, I think it says 15 days with Peter. And this is really the first time they've ever really talked. And so he's there. I think Paul's probably learning about Peter's time traveling with Christ and all that, and learning his story, but he's learning the heart. They're both learning the heart of each other, even though they don't really come to a full agreement at that time. And we know that because at the end of that, it says they left and are gone again. And he comes back 14 years later. I think about it. So many times we read this, we don't realize how much time has passed. For 14 years, Paul's out doing ministry completely apart from the rest of the church. He's going into all the Gentiles where God has told him to go. And again, another thought, I know I've thought of this before, but I never really gave it any in-depth thought till today. Peter's the one who had the vision from Christ. Remember when he goes to the house of Cornelius but Peter never did what he was supposed to do. And that's not to slam Peter. It's just like, I'm beginning to see why God called Paul and took him another direction to get him away from there, because he's already told Peter what to do. And Peter couldn't let go of the traditions. But here's the thing that I find fascinating as I think about this. You got Paul and his entourage over here preaching the grace as we know it today. And you got Peter and them over here, and they're preaching the gospel, but they're preaching a mixture, holding on to the Jewish things. The thing that I don't think I ever really realized, nowhere is Peter or any of the others rebuked. And it makes me realize some of the stuff that we nitpick and we fight about, I don't think God's really concerned about that. As long as we keep Christ foremost. Now, I'm not trying to excuse legalism or trying to mix the law with it, but it was like, I think, let me kind of back up and give you this story. This is kind of a oddball story, but when I was in Lee, one of my professors described something to me that, not just to me, but to the class. I really had a hard time grasping it. That the older I've gotten and the more I've thought about it, I kind of get it. Time doesn't exist outside of the earth. When God created the heavens and the earth, time began. So when God looks at us as a whole, he doesn't look at this morning, tonight, this year. My instructor said it's kind of like if you saw this big panoramic picture and he looks at it all as one whole. That's how God sees things. And that kind of makes sense of the scripture where it says a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. It is all the same in God's view. So when God's looking at this, he doesn't see 17 years passing by. He sees the church working out issues and was patient with that. I think that's part of God's patience. Again, he doesn't have a watch. Hey, they've been doing this for 7 days now. And you know how we get impatient about everything. And it's like, what are we waiting on? Let's get going. But that's not how God views things. Anyway, back on this. 14 years later, they come back to Jerusalem. Again, the same thing has happened. These Judaizers come in, start saying that they need to be baptized. Even when Paul comes back, he brings, I think it's Barnabas, and it says others. So he brings some of them, and some of them were Gentiles. I can't remember which one it is. One of them is a Greek, and they're not circumcised. As soon as they get there, I've always wondered how they did this. It says they checked and he wasn't circumcised. I don't know if they just asked him or if there was an inspection or what. Don't really need to know. But I think, now that's pretty nitpicky. If all they want to know is, it's not, have you accepted Christ? Have you done this? It's, are you circumcised? That's where we start getting into the legalistic nonsense. My point that I want to see is, I'm not going to go back and read it all right now, but if you want to go back and look at the 15th chapter, that when Paul starts talking in back in Galatians chapter 2, when he's talking about 14 years later, that's what's happening in Acts chapter 15. So any comments, questions about any of that? Did I make it clear?
You did, and I have a couple. One is, it's interesting to me when you're talking about, which I had not thought of, Paul going back to Jerusalem, back to his home, and the fact that, just imagine, he was persecuting the Jews, then he gets saved and he leaves, and 3 years later he comes back. For all he knew, he was going to be crucified, stoned, whatever, by the Jews. I mean, he had no idea what to expect, I don't think. And it's interesting because I never thought about that.
Well, that's a great point. Hang on with that thought just a minute, because this is really cool about that. I never thought about it till today. I was reading through there. Before he went to Jerusalem, he went to Damascus. Where was he when he was converted?
Yeah.
I mean, pretty cool.
It is. The other thing I was going to say is, in Galatians, I think it's Galatians, isn't that where, and I can't find it, I was looking, but that's when Paul does kind of rebuke Peter.
Absolutely.
About the circumcision. And up to that point, I don't think anybody had spoken up. Maybe because, I don't know, I'm just surmising here, but maybe because Peter was the rock that Christ said he would build his church on, that nobody questioned him. But
Mhm.
Paul called him out for saying that you had to be circumcised.
Yeah, I'm paying attention. I'm trying to find that because I'm confused right now. Is that in Galatians or Philippians? It's one of the two.
Yeah,
My other study I'm doing on Wednesday night right now is Philippians. So they're kind of running together in my head. I think it's in this one. I'm not seeing it, but I think it is in there.
I'm not seeing it either, but I think it is. If I have a different Bible, my other one is downstairs, or I probably could have found it.
We may find it in just a minute.
Yeah,
We're going to go through that.
I think it is in chapter 2, where he's talking about justification is by faith without the law.
Right. Yeah, there's so much packed into this that I don't want to sit here and dissect it for the next 6 months, but I want us to see some of this because it's really interesting what was going on, because there was a very strong dispute here. You know, if you notice the first time, we don't know how much it was, but the first time he came in, it doesn't really say Paul really confronted or rebuked it or anything at that point. But after 14 years more time out there in ministry, he does come back and rebukes Peter for it. And it says that he talks about to his face, he confronted him with that. And, you know, that's something that I think that bothers me. One of the biggest things that bothers me in the modern day church is people don't want pastors, especially, confronting anybody. And I think we all need to. When we see people, there's a difference between accusing somebody and confronting. And
Right.
if we see things that are in error or serious question, we have an obligation. I mean, if I truly love you and I see something like that and I ignore it, I'm responsible for what's going on in
That's
your
right.
life.
That's exactly right.
Uh,
Greg is saying he thinks, what did you
Well,
say, 14?
Maybe verse 14, if that, I'm not sure if that's kind of what you guys are looking for, but when he's actually talking to him. He said unto Peter.
Yeah, I think what is happening in my mind is I'm getting two of them confused, because that is the one that's talking about here, and I don't have my bookmark in here still, or do I? No, I pulled it out. I think in Philippians, he is talking to them about confronting Peter to his face. So, I mean, it wasn't like this was something that was hidden, because, again, you're dealing with the same thing there in Philippi that you're dealing with here in Galatia. And everywhere you go, you've got the same troublemakers following. By any chance, do you remember, you may have never heard of a guy named J. Vernon McGee? He used to be, I think he was Assembly guy, may have been Baptist, I'm not sure. He used to do a radio program through the Bible with J. Vernon McGee. Is long ago.
Yeah, now that you say that, I do remember that.
I used to love listening to him. I used to have all of his stuff on CDs, and I lost them in a fire years ago. Never have been able to find them again. But anyway, I loved how he was talking about this situation here, because he was saying that if we love somebody, we will confront. And he said, and if we don't, he said, we're basically saying that my feelings, sometimes we're afraid to confront because we don't know what the reaction is going to be. But, you know, here's Paul coming back. These are the leaders of the church. You know, I mean, Jerusalem was the center of the church, and he's coming back there telling them. And if you actually study that out from Acts 15, what happened, Paul brought back those other people with him as a witness to say, this is what has been happening while I've been out there preaching the gospel. And he brought witnesses to show there have been miracles, there have been signs and wonders, been people saved, filled with the Holy Ghost. How do you argue with that? I mean,
Right.
that's why he brought them all in there. Titus is the one I was looking for, because it's verse number 3. It says, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And notice verse 4 again. Here he is. It said, and because of that, false brethren unawares brought in, who came to privately spy out our liberty. I love that. There was people even within the council of the church, they're spying out, seeing, can we disrupt this whole thing? And it's like, so many times we think the problems we have today in the church are bad. It was bad then. You had people spying out, people going behind the scenes. And that's where I started to get at with J. Vernon McGee. I love something he said, and I have tried to keep this in mind throughout my ministry. He talked about, as a pastor, and he said, as an evangelist, he'd done both. He said, if I go in as an evangelist to a town to do ministry, I owe it to the pastors there to let them know what I'm doing. You don't come in without their knowledge and go do this stuff. And I think how many times I've seen that people come in and they're jumping in there. Yeah, I'm gonna go there. I just had this happen today. Doing the drive-through prayer and stuff. And a guy that I know, he came to visit our church one time. I've known him for 14 years. He just recently came just to come check us out because he's got a church. Anyway, he always stops by if he sees me doing drive-through prayer, just to stop and talk, see what's going on and stuff. And occasionally we'll get together. And today he calls me up, want to know if we can get together for a couple minutes. And he tells me that he saw another church in town doing drive-through prayer. And I said, great. He said, well, and he said, I knew that would be your attitude. He said, but I saw it and I thought it was part of your church. He said, and I asked them where you were. And he said, they had not a kind word to say for you. They badmouthed me. They badmouthed my church and my ministry. And I won't go into all that. He ripped into him something fierce, but that came to mind about J. Vernon McGee. It's like, we're not in competition here. Not just the churches, but an evangelist coming in. They should be coming in, seeing if they could draw your sheep away. It always bothered me. If I had an evangelist come in and pass out envelopes for people to send tithe and stuff to them or offerings it without consulting me,
Right.
they never came back to my church again. Because talk about a disrespect and causing division. I mean, if you're on the up and up with people, most pastors can say, sure, because there are people who are going to want to do that to support missions or whatever. Don't do it slyly. And that's what J. Vernon McGee was talking about. I've never forgotten that. It's a good thing. And I bring that up now because what did Paul do? When there is an issue in the church and people come, he didn't bother arguing with them. I mean, he discussed it with them. He went back to the head and sat down with them and talked about this and was willing to abide by their decision. That's what fascinates me. We're going to get into that in just a minute about how that the first time they really didn't come to any conclusion because the only ones he saw was Peter and James, which, by the way, I started to say this to you a while ago. Most people say Peter was the head of the church. We're going to see as we pull into this, James was the head of the church. It said when it came down to decision time, James, the one who said, I make this decision. I think he uses the word sentence, and he wrote the letter to the churches. So I hate to say it to our Catholic friends, but Peter was not the head of the church. Anyway, Ashley's in the dark.
The sun's going down, and I just don't feel like I never.
I know how you are, huh?
I like natural light. That's about it.
I've lost my spot here. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Let me go back to verse 4 and start there. It said, and because he taught, remember, Titus has come with him. They're checking out if he's circumcised. And because of the false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour. I hate the wording there. Depending on what translation, there might be a lot better. Basically saying we didn't give them any consideration. We're not going to listen to them. But then he goes back to the head of the church. He said, but these who seem to be somewhat, I love this. I love the way Paul writes. I think I've told you, Paul is my favorite writer. He doesn't pull any punches, but these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person. What he's saying there is they think they're all that. I didn't look at them that way. He didn't look at them as they were better than him or that they had more authority. Even though he acknowledged their authority, he didn't look at them as because of who they were. You have to honor them. And I'm going to get real personal for a minute. That's been always one of my pet peeves within the denomination. It's not just the one that I came out of and you came out of, but every denomination I know of. Officials come in and people just like, oh, we got to bow down. It shouldn't be that way.
Right.
One of the things I heard an older man, I don't know if you ever knew, got his name, Wayne Proctor. He was our state overseer when we were kids.
Yep.
Brother Proctor, he and his wife were just very, very dear friends to me and Libby. I was probably no more than 14, 15 years old, and I can't say I remember a lot of sermons from that period because I wasn't paying any attention. But I remember him talking about he was somewhere as state overseer and somebody had a flat tire and he took off his coat and tie and went out and changed that tire. And I thought, that's what an overseer ought to be. Because a minister is a servant. Everybody always wants to flip it around. And I'm not saying you got to go do everything, but you ought to be willing to.
That's right.
And I think that was kind of what we're seeing here, that Paul was the same thing, even though he has been out there, he knows Christ himself has called him, he knows he's had results, he still comes to them to get some direction and guidance from them. And at first, I'm not going to go through and read it all right now. At first, the first time after he left and he left and came back 14 years later, there was no real consensus. But when he comes back and he tells them and he has these witnesses, I love that when you read it, trying to find, I think it's verse number 9. Yeah, it says, then when James, Cephas is Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. In other words, they saw the fruit.
Yeah.
That's the thing that is so hard. And I'm trying not to get off in all these different tales and stuff, but I remember when we were at Lee, something that really, really bothered me for a long time. Do you know who Bill Wilson is out in New York?
No.
He has had a street ministry up there for decades. Bill Wilson he's the type of guy, he's been stabbed numerous times. Staff members have been stabbed. People have come into their ministry center and attacked them and stabbed them. But the guy has just got a heart. He worked with David Wilkerson a lot up there in New York City. And then he started his own ministry. Well, anyway, Bill Wilson came down to Lee to speak and had hair that reached halfway down his back. He wore a suit out of respect for the college, but that was completely out of his character. And as soon as it was over with, he was in jeans and a shirt out talking with us and everything. Several of my professors refused to go here and speak. They said they had no respect for the man. It's like this situation right here. You look at the fruit. You may not like what you see in the person. There's some guys I know here in town. No way to say it, but to say it. I hate rap. I can't stand it. It's not my thing. I love all kinds of music. I shouldn't say I can't stand it because there's some rap I do like, but it's not something I go listen to. If I happen to hear it, I might like it. But there's these two guys here in town that their dad used to be a pastor. He passed away a few years ago. And it's like the other day they were walking down the streets of the Labor Day parade rapping Christian music. I got tremendous respect for them. I don't care for it, but that's their calling, and it's like, God's blessing them can I just celebrate that? I don't have, who says I have to like it? You know,
Right.
as long as it's within reason. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen this. There are literally some fringe groups out there that are insane. There's strippers for Jesus and stuff like that. It's like, come on, you can't strip for Jesus. That's
Right.
but there are people who supposedly have that ministry, and I can't see that. But it's like, if it's within reason and it doesn't go against doctrines of the Bible, embrace it. I mean, and I think that's what happened here when they brought back. Think about how it must have been for Peter, for James, for John, and all the others are sitting there listening to this. Had to grate their nerves.
It made me think about when I don't think we've been in Galesburg too long, but I remember you telling the story about when you went down to the church in Georgia and when you saw like the flags and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like for Greg and Luann. So like he went down to this like larger church in Florida. They'd flown him and my mom down there, I believe. And at that time, that was not something you would see like at any really Church of God church that I had ever been to, at least traditional or anything. And there were these people waving flags and banners and things like that. And Dad was not a fan.
At all.
Like,
there was
you can tell it's your story.
I was going to tie two of them together because they happened very close together. Guy who was pastoring in the state. Well, you knew Terry Watson, right? Remember Terry?
Yep.
His daughter, Tara. I love Tara dearly. I mean, she just looked up to me and Libby, but she got up at camp meeting and did a Christian drama, kind of the mime type.
Yep.
And when she got up there with her face all painted up and everything, self-righteous me said, oh, this would be rich. And I literally got up out of my seat and walked to the back of the tabernacle. But as I began to watch her, my heart broke. And I thought, Lord, forgive me. Because here I am judging something that she's touching people that I will never touch. You know, and it's like, same thing with the flags that she was saying. Now, I've seen some people do it when they worship with flags. It is, look at me. But I watch these guys absolutely do spiritual warfare down there in that church in Georgia with those flags. As they were, I watched somebody healed that I know of. Nobody spoke a word. I'm sure they were praying, but they were dancing around with these flags, and there was a woman healed. How do you argue with that? You know, it's like something's going on here that God is honoring, but in myself, it's like, I've never seen that, so I don't like it. It's kind of, honestly, that's the way we usually are. We've never seen it. It's not the way I've always done things, so I don't like it. Get rid of it. Yeah. You've got to think that Peter and James and John and whoever else is in this group at first are thinking, who is this guy? Don't forget who Paul is. Paul was a Pharisee. He said he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. This man is Jewish to the core, and he's coming in trying to tell them, throw out everything you've been told. I know that there was part of them that said, who is he? But and I think the Holy Spirit had to have led him to bring the people back, to tell the testimonies and how God healed them, how God saved them, delivered them. And when they saw it, it says, when they saw the grace, you know, grace is not just God's grace, it's the grace we give to one another. When they saw that, they gave me the right hand of fellowship. And basically what I hear in that is, we may not agree with you, but we can't argue with the results, you know?
Yeah. It makes me think about how in today's time, it would be like someone who was maybe even a Satanist and ridiculed and persecuted Christians and wanted to kill Christians. And then they got saved and came to church. Just think about what pastors, especially a pastor who had been persecuted by that individual, just think about how you would react and respond. It would take the Holy Spirit to quicken you to be able to forgive and accept.
Absolutely.
Well, even to go further, if you go back, something that we talked about in my church that I know I talked to Dad about was like the community, like the disciples in general were like a ragtag bunch. Like there was no, and they, by any means, like they should not have ever gotten along with one another. Some of them should have been sworn enemies against each other, really based off of where they came from. And then like looking from an outsider's perspective after Christ, is risen, all that's happened. I don't know. I try to think about like, I mean, now we have the news and everything, but it's like some of these people, you got to think about how gossip works and everything. And I know it's different back in that time, but I just think about like how they shouldn't have even gotten along. And now they're leading together what's to become the church.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's just interesting.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and to your point too, the thing that is so miraculous, which is how you know it's God, is it started out with 12 disciples, and there weren't phones and there wasn't TV and you couldn't get online, and it was word of mouth, but Christ had already ascended and they're out there telling things. And of course there were miracles and healings and things, but other than those few people, nobody saw Jesus other than those few. Nobody knew the things that he did. So to me, when I think about, chokes me up. When I think about that, I think, wow, how miraculous is that here we are 2,000 plus years later, and we know all about Christ when it started like that. To me, it just blows my mind. It blows my mind, literally.
Yeah, let me go back to what Ashley was just saying, because it tags. I finally found the verse we were looking for, because it's the next one. Verse number 11, it says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed." I'm not going to read it all, but actually what it says there, Peter comes to them away from Jerusalem, and then it's all okay. But when he goes back to Jerusalem, he plays the other side of the coin. Peter was a big coward. He really was, because he was swaying with the wind. Let's put it that way. That, when he knew when to be legalistic, he knew when to be graceful, and that's what Paul confronted him about. He never confronted him about the legalistic stuff. He confronted him about switching sides back and forth all the time.
Yeah, the Bible that I have downstairs, I forget the translation that it is, but it literally calls it hypocrisy.
Yes, absolutely.
And in this, this is life application. It says, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you read the next couple of verses, again, I don't want to take the time to read everything, but it was basically saying that you got to remember those guys never ate with the Gentiles and stuff. Well, when he came there, he sat and ate with the Gentiles. But then when he went with the others, he kind of hung with that crowd, and it's like, this is a passage that when I studied this in Lee is when it really began to start hitting me. Excuse me. I would watch pastors that when the overseers come, not just the state overseer, but the elected officials from Cleveland, they put on a whole different air about them. And it's like people, what was that? People would tell me all the time and said, you need to learn how to be diplomatic. I'm like, no, I need to be me. I am who I am, and I don't put on false airs for anybody. I'm not saying I won't do things respectfully, but I'm not going to change who I am. And I'm not going to act a certain way just because you're an overseer or you're pastor a church. The church that Ashley was talking about, a friend of ours pastors it, has 10,000 members. But if you saw Jim and I sitting together, you would think we were pastoring equal churches. because it doesn't matter to him. And, and it does. It's one of the things that first drew me to him is, long story short, the way I got connected with him was a friend who had gone there. He gave Jim my name. Jim and his church paid to bring me and Libby down there. They paid our airfare. They paid for our rental car. They put us, I started saying a motel. They put us in a country club for a week, paid for every meal we had, and treated us like we were royalty. And he said that God was using his church to train up young ministers. And he's always been that way, even though here he is pastoring a church, 10,000 members. I can't imagine. I've pastored in towns of 1,100 people, and but he just, if he walked into the room right now, didn't matter who's around, he'd run over and grab me and hug my neck, just as he would an overseer. That's the way it ought to be in the body of Christ. And it's not like, that's what Paul said back in a couple verses ago, that we talk about God being no respecter of persons. We shouldn't be either. We shouldn't act a certain way just because of a position it has. Now, I'm not saying don't respect their office. I've said that many, many times. I mean, there's sometimes, I hate to admit it, but it's true. I have respected the office of overseer even when I can't respect the man.
Yeah. Well, that's what you're called to do.
That's one of the first things. I wasn't going to say anything earlier, but that's exactly what I thought when I started with Church of God and all that. It's like, man, well, when the overseer shows up, you think the good Lord was walking through the door.
Yeah.
Things changed, but something's hit me for the last 20 minutes. While all I could keep thinking is that, one of the first things we were taught was God is love.
Mm-hmm.
And if we would try to filter things more through love, we wouldn't have all this diplomacy and bureaucracy and our human tendencies to the power struggle and as far as even back in the day, you're talking about it, even though, Peter would act one way and then he'd go with a different group and change. But if you filter things through love, that kind of sifts all that
Junk.
crap out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would call it.
No, yeah. And that gets back to, so one of the first things I remember, God is love, Jesus is love. And it, the word, it's really simple. We're the ones that make this difficult. The instruction book's right here on how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to jump into next week for just a second, and we'll come back and talk about this more next week. But, the thing about the gospel of Christ, we've made it so much of this and so much of that, but it is simply this. I made just a very short TikTok video today. And I said, this thought hit me. We want to make it, even when when we're talking about getting saved, we'll ask them, would you commit your life to Christ? I would say Christ is not interested in your life. The Bible says we die and allow him to live through us. That's right. What we're called to do. It's not about, look at me doing all this for Jesus. It's about, I'm dead to myself. Jesus, do whatever you want through me. And I have people say this to me all the time, and I'm not trying to pat me on the back. They're saying, how can you do that? It's so undignified. And how can you let people talk to you like that? It's like, I died. It's like my wife, I wish she was in here, has said this so many times over the years. I know Ashley's heard it. She said, I wish I had known you back then. I'm like, no, you don't. That guy ceased to exist. And I said, and I promise you, if you had met him, we would have never got past the first moment. That would have been it. And the point is, if we truly die, it's not about, okay, family. We're at the family reunion the other day, and a couple of my sisters and my brother got me pulled aside. How's the church doing? Is this? And all they really want to know is, how's it doing financially? And I'm like, all the bills are paid.
Yeah, do you have money and how many people?
Yeah, exactly. And that's how we've always judged things. But you know what? It's like, to me, it's absolutely miraculous that since we started this, we've been blessed. You know, so one of my good friends came in here a couple of weeks ago and looked at it. It's like, yeah, it's a small little building. It's like this last week, you guys don't know yet, we bought a piano this week finally, or electric keyboard and stuff. You know, and it's like, we've got stuff that churches that have been around for 20 years don't have. God just keeps blessing. And it's like, we got this keyboard. This lady was advertising it for $950. When she found out it was a church, she gave it to me for $350. You know, and it's like, that's God, you know, and it's like, that's how you do things. I was trying to tell my brother and sisters, I said, you know, I said, quit worrying about me. I said, do I look like I'm not eating? You know, it's like, I'm obviously getting plenty to eat. All of our bills are paid. The church bills are paid. Well, how are you doing? And I said, God, that's it. When you die to yourself, you quit worrying about it. I'm not going to say I don't sit sometimes and think, okay, how are we going to do this? But, you know, God is faithful. I'm sure that it's not just in church, it's in your own lives. You know, my little girl sitting there, she's not so little anymore. She amazes me. She has got the most generous heart I've ever seen. And I won't go into her personal details. It doesn't matter. But I mean, there's been times that windfalls of money came to her and she'll contact me and say, I just felt like I need to give this to church. Just sends it, you know, and stuff like that. And it's like, there's other people have done the same thing. You guys have been a blessing. There's been people all over the place. And it's like, when you quit worrying about it, quit stressing and understand, God, this is your church. I'm your vessel. Do what you want to do. It all fits together. And it's the same for everybody.
That makes me think back to kind of the conversation I think we were having the last time, where I was talking about, you know, walking in the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it may not be shouting and talking in tongues, that's what you're really doing, is you're walking in the Spirit when you have you're crucifying the flesh, which happens on a daily basis, has to happen. But to me, that's what I think about when you see things and when you say things like that it's God. Those are spiritual eyes seeing that. It's not the flesh that sees that. Those are spiritual eyes that see it that way. And it's hard for people who maybe aren't Christian or maybe have strayed from the path or whatever to see that and be calm about it. It just is a difficult situation for outside to look in and feel the same way. I mean, Greg and I talk about it all the time, that I'll say something and I'll go, oh my gosh, that's just God. Do you see what God's doing? I can't even tell you the number of things that he has done for us. It's been amazing. And so I said all that just to say it takes me back to, you're walking in the Spirit. You're seeing things with spiritual eyes.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, you know, coming from our background, our church was a true Pentecostal church, run the aisles. And I love that. Don't get me wrong. I still love that. It's not been happening here yet. Sometimes it gets frustrating, but it's like, I love this because I talk about the financial aspects, but God's doing other things as well. We've seen people saved. A couple of weeks, I think I talked about this. I don't remember if I did or not. I preached a message, and right at the very end of the message, I stopped talking to the congregation. I talked to the camera, and I said, there's somebody out there. And long story short, 9:30 that night, somebody over in Indiana calls me up asking questions. And before it's all said and done, I lead this lady to Christ. And we've got a lady here in our church that funny thing is, she never stopped. She saw me out doing drive-through prayer. She was afraid to stop, so she went and got her brother and told him to go back and talk to me. So he came and talked to me, found out what we were all about. He's come a few times, but she has been to church pretty well every Sunday since then, missing a few because not too long after she came, she was diagnosed with cancer, and they've actually found cancer in 5 different parts of her body. And one night while I was preaching, as calm as could be, I turned around and I said, I decree this place a cancer-free church. she just looked at me, and after church, I tell her, I said, I'm telling you, it's gone. 2 weeks ago, she went to the doctor. She messaged me right afterwards. She said, I need to talk with you. She said, I cannot wait till Sunday. And I'm thinking something bad wrong. And she said, I went to the doctor today, and what was a cancer? The doctor said, I don't understand it. There's no cancer. He said, all I see is a little bit of skin inflammation. Cancer's gone.
Wow.
And it's like,
Good.
go ahead.
That's all.
I thought you were saying something. I guess not. My screen, if you start to say something, she may have made a noise or something, it lights up yellow. So I don't know if
Yeah,
yours does.
ours does too.
Well, whoever's
Was
talking,
it
like,
me?
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I
Ashley,
said
you
wow.
popped up.
Oh,
Yeah, whenever somebody's talking, that's who pops up.
Yeah,
okay.
I just said wow. I'm on my phone,
Oh,
so it's
there you
actually showing me both of you like half screen, half screen. So
Yeah, mine's never done this before. I was seeing all of you at once tonight, and it doesn't usually do that. Sometimes it does. I have not figured out what they've done. This whole thing has changed so much. I even got out and did a little meeting with a friend of mine trying to figure it out. It's not the same. So I'm gonna have to either find some directions or something, because a few things are changed on here. Hang on just a minute. I'm gonna shut the recording off. Yes, I want to stop it.